Hello.
We're looking at a tough few weeks, at least a few weeks, and probably a tough few months here at the start of 2021. But we're very much hoping it will get better as the year goes on.
Okay, sir. Can you give us a brief intro about Dr. Dominic Dean, the person?
Yes, certainly. And thank you very much for your introduction already. And thank you for hosting my talk today. Much appreciated. So, yeah, as you mentioned, I'm an early career researcher, particularly in contemporary British fiction. And I work mainly on representations of children, particularly children and violence in contemporary British fiction. And really the main theoretical frame that I use for that work is Psychoanalytic 1, and that's been fairly constant since much earlier on in my research. And it's something that's very central to the field of childhood studies within the humanities as well. Psychoanalysis is definitely one of the main theoretical frames for that. So it's always been a very natural fit for me. As you've mentioned, I've published on it a fair bit already, and I'm looking very much forward to having my book on the topic out, hopefully, towards the end of this year. So yeah, thank you again for the introduction.
Okay, sir. So with that said, I think the audience are quite eager to listen to your lecture, and I hand over the entire session to Dr. Dominic Dean. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much indeed. Yeah, I'm very excited to speak to everyone online today. So today's lecture will make the case that psychoanalysis really remains an essential framework for literary criticism in the 21st century and for understanding how literature reflects and interrogates some of the most central and also some of the most fraught aspects of contemporary life. So not only is psychoanalysis, I'm going to argue, the right framework for literary criticism in the 21st century, it's also essential for understanding how literature itself is working and dealing with some of our big problems and challenges in the 21st century. However, before I get to that, I'm going to start with a short overview of some of the main ideas of Sigmund Freud, his ideas and his successors on literary theory, and a discussion of the sometimes controversial place of psychoanalysis within current trends in literary criticism, perhaps exploring some of the modes of reading that psychoanalysis promotes, and touching on some of the arguments that apply to that. And then I'll go on to explore, as I've said, how psychoanalytic frameworks allow us to better understand how literature mediates some major contemporary challenges for societies across the world. And in that context, I'm going to be talking particularly about generational conflict, battles over the rights to autonomy and privacy, and the struggles to realize humane values in a world defined by renewed geopolitical divides and resurgent nationalisms, alongside ever greater technologically enabled connectedness. And I'm going to talk about those phenomena in some works of literary fiction from some of the contemporary British authors that I work on, including people like Alan Hollinghurst, Sarah Waters, David Szalay, and Kazuo Ishiguro. At this point, I am just going to share some slides for my talk. So bear with me, I will get the slideshow started here. Now, I should acknowledge as I start that I'll be addressing these questions from within a primarily British context, as that's the context that I know best, of course, but I hope that my points will find some resonance with viewers in other parts of the world. And on that note, I think it's striking how psychoanalysis itself is always curiously between a parochial and an internationalist perspective. Freud lived and worked in Vienna from the late 19th to the mid 20th century, and his work is highly shaped by that very local context that he lived in and by the norms of the society that he knew, though Freud did come to Britain as a refugee from the Nazis for the final year of his life. And psychoanalysis today remains very invested, I would say, in internationalism and in migration, but at the same time, its popularity is also highly concentrated within specific parts of the world. I should say as well in opening that in my characterizations of Freud and some of the arguments that I'm going to make today, I won't, of course, have time to go into every nuance or every side of some disputed points about psychoanalytic theory. Freud's own theorizing, which provides the basis of psychoanalytic criticism and continues to be a major object of textual study in its own right, as well as a major theoretical framework an interpretive framework for the humanities, was also something that was developed over time, was somewhat contradictory, and of course is very much argued over by his successors. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the insights and influence of Freudian. So Sigmund Freud has been widely understood, including by Freud himself, as the father of psychoanalysis and certainly one of the most influential figures in 20th century medical, cultural, and intellectual life. Freud's practice of what he called the talking cure, that kind of basic method of psychoanalysis, is a person-centered therapy to address debilitating and difficult to diagnose troubles amongst his patients. And Freud's explanation of adult problems through the legacy of childhood dynamics have both had lasting effects on the conception and management of the individual's position in the social world and their personal and medical adaptation to it. And although Freud's original and primary frame of reference was medicine and the treatment of patients, his series of theories that form the basis of psychoanalysis both drew from and gained a much broader intellectual reach and set of cultural reference points. Freud was himself a prolific writer, and many of his theories were articulated compellingly in narrative form. Narratives like those of the patients given the pseudonyms of the Wolfman, the Ratman, Anna O, and others that made rich characters out of Freud's patients. And these are narratives that confidently move between individual symptoms and claims about the human condition in general. Freud's characterization of the sources of his patients' problems, which tended to depend on the alleged uncovering of childhood trauma and the passing of its complicated legacies, were and remain highly controversial both in their methodology and their conclusions. These conclusions could be as radical and as counterintuitive or just plain odd, for example, as suggesting that the problems of a patient who presented with bowel difficulties lay in his early and repressing witnessing of his parents engaged in a sexual act. That's the Wolfman case study. And Freud has often been accused of manipulating the power of suggestion in promoting his ideas and his diagnoses of individuals. And it's certainly true that his published case studies or case histories drew authority through their imaginative force and through his authorial voice. So, as with literature, it seems that if a scenario is painted richly enough, however improbable it may initially have seemed, it becomes imaginable. So Freud's case histories do function like literature in their own right, certainly in that respect. So the Freudian approach, I'm suggesting, functions in a way somewhat similar to literature and with the same capacity to represent intimate and social life in a way that carries the inherent possibility or risk of transforming it. Freud uses quasi-literary motifs. He believes that the objects of our fear and desire are displaced and transformed between our unconscious and our conscious mind. He thought, for example, that the wolves about which the Wolfman dreamed actually stood in for his parents. Freud thought in terms of symbol and metaphor. He also wrote and thought within an extensive literary framework. He draws repeatedly on classical mythology and on major canonical authors such as Shakespeare and Goethe, alongside many other ancient and modern writers. He assumes that literary figures and narratives can be treated as at least somewhat equivalent to real patients and their modern experiences, and that diagnoses can be made for both by reading across both. And this is one of the things that's very odd about reading Freud now as a reader in the 21st century, that he is moving from this albeit 19th century, but still kind of recognizably scientific medical framework into claims about society, about humanity in general, that are quite literary in nature, and that certainly have a very wide cultural scope. So given these tendencies, it's perhaps unsurprising that Freud has been profoundly influential on practices of literary criticism since at least the mid-20th century. Indeed, in the 21st century, Freudian thought is, I think it's very fair to say, much more influential on literary scholarship than it is on psychological and medical disciplines, certainly in any explicit sense. Freud's theories have informed key themes in modern literary theory and literary criticism, such as the uncanny and the performative nature of gender. Contemporary theoretical work on gender and sexuality, which is still often today understood as radical and received as controversial, is often surprisingly close in its debt to Freud's own theories. For example, I think of a major piece of theoretical work in my own field, which is the scholar Catherine Bond-Stockton's 2009 book, The Queer Child, which at its intellectual base is rooted still in Freud's idea of homosexuality as a kind of stuck phase in normative sexual development. So psychoanalysis after Freud has also had a broad and deep influence on literary criticism. In Freud's lifetime and beyond, members of his immediate circle of followers and those who are influenced at greater geographical and temporal distance all developed Freudian ideas in new ways and in radically different directions, applying and engaging them with fields including psychiatry, linguistics, philosophy, and of course, literary, film, and arts theory. Some of Freud's successors, such as his daughter Anna and British psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott, developed his focus on children and childhood and parenting in ways that continue to influence our understanding of the relationships of the relationships between early experience and adult life. Of course, at the most basic level, Freud's influence there is evident just on the sheer importance that is given to childhood, and early childhood and parenting in our contemporary life, something that we oftentimes take for granted, but still can be in significant respects traced back to Freud. Later 20th century theorists like Jacques Lacan developed Freudian thought in innovative forms that provided a deep and flexible theoretical language for the humanities. And despite significant criticism of Freud's gender politics, since the 1960s, his work has formed a major basis for scholarship on gender, influencing a significant body of gender theory in film and the visual arts, for example, led by scholars such as Laura Mulvey. And the cumulative effects of the development of and from Freud's thought after his death have been to deepen and broaden the relationships between psychoanalysis and literary criticism and the humanities as a whole, whilst distancing it somewhat from its roots in medicine. In the 21st century, however, psychoanalytic literary critics such as Josh Cohen have challenged this by restoring the relationship between psychoanalysis as theoretical framework for literature and as the basis for clinical practice, whilst also bringing psychoanalysis to bear on major debates over contemporary public and private life. All these developments have also been against the background of a massive influence of Freudian thought on popular culture since the middle of the 20th century, not least in Hollywood, for example. Ideas like the Oedipus complex, the Freudian slip, the uncanny, repressed and transferred sexual desire, the definitive role of childhood, and even just the practice of a patient talking to an analyst have provided a rich theme of representations, parodies, tropes, and cliches within late 20th and early 21st century popular culture. Some of this can be exploitative and crude at times, like, for example, the relationship between the Oedipus complex and violence in horror movies, but it does underscore the broad penetration of our culture by psychoanalytic ideas. As a result, when teaching psychoanalysis and literature today, students often come with some familiarity over its basic ideas. And at this point, I just want to mention some of the psychoanalytic ideas that are particularly central for literary criticism, which include the following broad formulations. So there's the idea of the self as split, one's own motivations as not always transparent, even to oneself. So not only do others not know why we might do things, we don't often know ourselves. And that can apply both to some of the most banal actions of everyday life through to actions we might take that cause some kind of rift in our family or our society. There's also the idea that childhood experience is continually recalled within and influential upon adult actions. And also that the original memory of that experience can be reshaped in the course of development, in the course of the telling as well. So there's an interesting ambiguity there between fact and fiction. Freud, of course, does always ultimately insist on the factual underpinnings of his ideas, his diagnoses. But when one reads deeply into his work, he does in fact introduce more ambivalence about that than it appears at first glance. And so, like literature itself, there are certainly elements of fiction in some of Freud's scenarios, but of course, it's always fiction that is certainly claiming its own particular kind of truth. There's the idea that even ordinary people sometimes desire things that are impractical, dangerous, or otherwise perverse. So, for example, Freud thinks that having very violent desires or impulses towards people that one knows very well is completely normal. There are many other kinds of perversity that ordinary people might engage in. And there's the idea that repressed memories can be provoked by seemingly unrelated events or objects, and that this can have a significant influence on individual actions. Above all, perhaps, psychoanalysis is concerned with motivation. It believes that every human action has a driving need behind it, whether that be for food, shelter, sex, or even the need to die. But these drives have to be accommodated within both the individual and their society, although that accommodation is always bound to go wrong at times, and in divided societies that indulge fantasies or demand a stressfully excessive level of repression, potentially it might go wrong rather often. And I'll argue shortly that psychoanalysis is particularly helpful as a framework for understanding some of our own contemporary social and generational divisions. Since the mid-20th century, psychoanalysis has become increasingly well established within literary criticism, both as a theoretical framework in its own right and as an influence on other modes of reading, such as queer and feminist criticism, but also even encompassing historicist modes of reading. In the past 2 decades, psychoanalytic criticism has become increasingly subject to academic critique in terms of its effects. It is in some respects at odds with contemporary movements in critical practice, particularly those that advocate for what is called distant or surface form reading. This argument is captured well by a 2009 essay that in which Stephen Best and Sharon Marcus set out an agenda in literary criticism that continued to develop throughout the subsequent decade. And they say, I quote, "In the text-based disciplines, psychoanalysis and Marxism have had a major influence on how we read. And this is expressed most consistently in the practice of symptomatic reading, a mode of interpretation that assumes that a text's truest meaning lies in what it does not say, describes textual surfaces as superfluous, and seeks to unmask hidden meanings. For symptomatic readers, texts possess meanings that are veiled, latent, all but absent if it were not for their irrepressible and recurring symptoms." End quote. So Best and Marcus are articulating there the idea of the symptom as something encompassing both a medical symptom and a textual symbol or trace. The key point is that the symptom, normally involuntarily, gives away the existence of something that exists beneath the surface. And this is indeed quite a central idea in psychoanalytic modes of reading literature. And Best and Marcus argue that this can be an unhelpful, perhaps even unethical model for literary criticism, partly because of the rather dominant and all-seeing role it seems to allocate to the critical reader, who approximately corresponds here to the analyst who carries out a psychoanalysis, both of them acting as masterful interpreters, gifted or trained into an insight beyond that available to the uninitiated. So just keeping that academic debate over the principles in mind, in the rest of the lecture now, I want to explore why I think psychoanalytic practices of reading effectively stand up to that critique, without necessarily dismissing that critique completely. And of course, I want to argue that they remain essential for our reading practices and for our literature itself. Today, I want to do this through suggesting how psychoanalysis helps us to understand and interpret some major contemporary challenges that impact on our practices of reading and on the subject matter of contemporary literature. And the first of these themes about our kind of current condition, if you like, is generational change and conflict. We live in a period of major cultural changes between generations, which often turn into intergenerational conflict over issues such as migration, race, gender, and sexuality. The scale and intensity of this intergenerational conflict is evident here today in the United Kingdom, for example, in arguments over transgender rights and the country's relationship with the transnational institutions of the European Union. Now, despite the apparently vast differences between the substances of such issues, there's a significant degree of consistency in the generational divides and attitudes towards them. These divides are marked by being not just what one might call ordinary differences of political opinion, but by becoming conflicts over reality itself, over what counts as real and therefore should be the basis of public policy and indeed of healthy choices in private life. Psychoanalysis and literature are, of course, both concerned with mediating the relationship between the public and the private, and with negotiating the accepted nature of reality. Now, psychoanalysis illuminates such generational conflicts over the nature of reality by emphasizing how social reality is always individually mediated. For Freud, making his observations of his patients and others in Vienna, the way one saw a house, a cart, a horse, a policeman, a rose in a garden was never quite the same from one person to another, and therefore how people live in, buy, consume, avoid, and appreciate such things was never the same either. In other words, the psyche significantly organizes social life. We're not normally aware of this because, of course, there is a sufficient degree of social consensus over the rules of behavior, and even more fundamentally, the nature of reality. Normally, there's enough to get by, according to Freud at least. But that consensus, Freud also thinks, is always more fraught than it looks, and it can significantly break down, as it eventually did in Freud's own Vienna, leading to his need to flee that city, and as it is doing in various parts of our world today, in an era of extreme polarization and conflicts over even the most basic social and material facts, something that we've seen emphasized again over the past few days, as indeed we have for the past few years now. Psychoanalysis insists on both an underlying consistency in human needs and a flexibility and variety in how they're met by the accommodations the individual makes with the material and social options available to them. For example, as a Freudian concept, the Oedipus complex is sometimes criticized as reductive and simplistic, but although Freud can indeed be rather rigid at times, that Oedipus complex is in fact rather more flexible than it looks at first glance. A key theme in Freud's understanding of individual, familial, and social dynamics is his belief in a certain fluidity between the processes of what he calls identification, on the one hand, and object choice on the other. The Oedipus complex is, at its simplest, an account of how a young male comes to identify with his father and take his mother, and eventually other women in place of the mother, as his object of desire and domination. But Freud imagines some quite dramatic steps along the way to this conventional heterosexual destination, and he also suggests that the child can get stuck or swapped around on some of those steps, as he believes happens for homosexuals. For Freud, very different scenarios can meet the same, or at least closely related, underlying needs and drives, even though they operate quite differently on the social surface. Psychoanalysis, therefore, not only helps us to understand some conflicts over the nature of reality, it can suggest a common language that might begin to address them, at least in principle. Now, we can see how these ideas work, I think, when applied to contemporary literature that deals with social. Sarah Waters' 2009 novel The Little Stranger, for example, depicts how the major social changes in Britain in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War were felt across generations, classes, and genders in ways that would have felt very deeply and produce hostile, even violent reactions. And Waters explores this through the role of the poltergeist at the center of the action in her novel, The Little Stranger. And this poltergeist is a spectre whose reality is disputed and who seems to echo the desires and fears of several of the characters in the novel without being definitively identified with any single one of them. Don't have time right now to get into all of the arguments about who and what the poltergeist might signify, but certainly overall argue that the disruption and danger caused by this poltergeist and the insecurity in its identification are used by Sarah Waters to imply that each character is trying to achieve or restore a social position commensurate with their own drives and their sense of their proper relations, unconscious sense sometimes of their proper relations with others within the family unit and in broader society. The poltergeist's phantasmic nature indicates the paradox that these psychic positions do not amount to a recognizable shared reality, since the conflicts are so strong that they involve the nature of reality itself. Yet, at the same time, those conflicts do all share undeniably real and material consequences. This, of course, is the paradox of the poltergeist, where you've got something that can move objects around a room, for example, actually very disruptively and violently, but you can't actually identify the force that's doing so. So that's why the poltergeist is such a good metaphor here. Although psychoanalysis, like Sarah Waters' tactics as an author, suggests that identity and object choice are flexible and variable, this doesn't make them any less consequential. And we can see another variation on these themes in the work of another contemporary British author, who I also happened to work on, Alan Hollinghurst. In his 2004 novel, The Line of Beauty, Hollinghurst depicts a semi-accidental infiltration of the high social circles surrounding the UK's Thatcher government in the 1980s by a young gay man, drawing in themes around homophobia and hostility towards migration from the Britain of that period. Audaciously, Hollinghurst proposes a parallel between gay subcultures in 1980s London and the right-wing fan culture surrounding the person of Margaret Thatcher, which the novel's protagonist refers to as, quote, heterosexual queenery. Both parts of 1980s British society, despite their aggressive opposition to each other and the extreme generational divide that also represents, are both imagined here as simultaneously releasing young men from the restrictions of older social models, fulfilling their needs in new ways, fulfilling the drive that Hollinghurst associates with the promiscuous sexuality and drug use that's common to both groups and across the generations in his novel anyway. Now, when we read these literary examples with psychoanalytic ideas in mind, we can start to observe how different models of social life might serve the same fundamental drives. We might start to imagine that, as these authors prompt us to do. But at the same time, as these authors also show, because people are powerfully invested in the specific models themselves, this does not prevent them entering into aggressive conflict over which model is most real and most valid. Literature itself serves as a way of generating such models, of course, as do many of the phenomena in which psychoanalysis is interested, like dreams, myth, and obsessive fantasy. As a basis for literary analysis, psychoanalysis allows us to both observe the power of the appeal of such models of, like, alternative reality, alternative facts, and to contextualize them, helping to create a shared language that crosses even the most aggressive conflict. Also in the 21st century so far, individual autonomy and privacy and agency have been increasingly centered in human rights discourse and on policy issues from gender to migration. According to the advocates of societies must accommodate the autonomy of those with visibly different lives during this period of intergenerational change, and the social effects, and as the social effects of late 20th and early 21st century globalization and migration mature. However, this priority faces not only political opposition, but also significant constraints from technological developments and the personal data-driven economy with which they interact. Psychoanalytic frameworks provide an essential lens, I think, for rigorous, humane understanding of such phenomena and are represented in literature. In the contemporary politics of gender and race, for example, the right of the individual to speak and to be heard and as an autonomous and agentic subject have become increasingly central to progressive politics. And the arguments over how this should be enacted in practice cross over significantly with public discourse around fiction, not least because, as I've already alluded to, contemporary political differences tend to turn on arguments about the nature of reality itself. We can see this, for example, again in a particularly UK context, but one that might have some resonance around the world, in how the massively popular Harry Potter author J.K. Rowling has become enmeshed in some very fraught arguments over transgender people and their claim to be really the gender with which they identify or to be accepted as non-binary. Rowling's view Rowling's view that such claims to autonomy should not, in fact, be wholly supported, overlaps with her understanding of her own fictional worlds, where she is quite famous for claiming the right to authoritatively pronounce on her characters' lives outside of the works themselves, outside of the texts themselves, as though these characters were in fact real, in the belief that these pronouncements carry an authority from her as the author that her readers, including potentially literary critics as well as fans, cannot share. Rowling is an advocate for authorial autonomy, but only within what she understands to be the transparent realities of owning either a gendered body or a body of work, or both. A psychoanalytic approach would, I think, see this as fundamentally too simple, because it overlooks how texts and characters are always received from within a particular psychic dynamic that will never be absolutely shared between author and reader. Now, a crudely liberal response to that proposition that I've just articulated would be to say that, therefore, psychoanalysis supports the view that a text or character can be whatever I, the reader, say it is, and therefore all interpretations are equally valid, which produces perhaps a rather flat version of autonomy, could produce a rather flat version of criticism. Although many of us might indeed approach textual interpretation this way as casual readers or fans, this is not, in my view, actually in line with the fuller implications of psychoanalysis for literary criticism as a more, hopefully a more rigorous practice than casual reading. So rather than seeing myself either as an interpretive reader or as the originating author having definitive authority to pronounce on the meaning of the work, psychoanalysis should, I think, rather lead us to see the text as a material and historical entity, the implications of which for its readers are nevertheless never absolutely fixed and transparent. In this scenario, our autonomy as critical readers and ultimately as citizens and human subjects emerges rather from the lack of transparency, the privacy, we might say, involved in our psychic experience. So although there is indeed an external historical reality in this scenario, one involved in reading as much as in other aspects of life, Freud himself would certainly have agreed that that was the case, I think. Nevertheless, our authority to define the relationship of other human subjects to that reality is properly very limited. As a theoretical framework, then, psychoanalysis can correctly be seen as inviting pluralist criticism, but also as simultaneously demanding rigorous attention to the limits of individual knowledge and knowledge of others. In this, it is well placed to make some theoretical sense of our contemporary controversies and the issues of autonomy and privacy at stake within them. Now, I'm coming towards the final section of my talk, and in this section, I'm going to suggest that as a result of its emphasis on the limitations of human subjects to really know the interior lives of others, despite at the same time being wholly predicated on the existence of rich, complex, and diverse interior lives, psychoanalysis is especially well suited to our era of distant. I'll explain exactly what I mean by distant connections here. So as we enter the third decade of the 21st century, I think we can see that the century so far has been characterized at least by two broad themes. So first, an increased sense of global threat, one that it arises from crises within, for example, globalization, migration, and which is particularly and perhaps most profoundly within the challenge of climate change, but which is most evident at present in the COVID-19 pandemic. So there's an increased sense of global threat, and this is something that's really marked the early 21st century so far, I'm suggesting. Second theme is a sense that humanity is becoming increasingly connected, albeit with new constraints on those connections that did not historically apply. Social media has connected more people across the world than any previous technology, with, for example, 2.7 billion Facebook users across the globe in 2020, almost 30% of humanity. Technologically supported connections have suddenly become even more significant during the COVID-19 era, with many people now working and socializing even more through online platforms, as of course I'm doing today. We're closer then to different others than ever before, yet these are, in crucial respects, distant connections. We can block, mute, and ignore people through these platforms and be highly selective about with whom we engage in ways that did not have direct equivalents in older forms of social existence. On a more political level, the age of social media and global connectedness has not produced a utopia of united global citizens. You might have noticed that it's failed to do that, but has rather increased the awareness of global threats and often changed their nature and shaped the evolution of those threats. The 2010s, as I alluded to earlier, saw a significant resurgence of nationalist movements, and some of the reactionary political campaigns involved in that trend were significantly driven through social media platforms. This has often been accompanied in liberal discourse by heightened anxiety over the role of selective online connections on and the relationship of that to political extremism, with social media platforms becoming echo chambers at best and insulated communities of the dangerous and the deluded at worst. Literary fiction, of course, has always been involved in mediating the connections between the individual and the world, and in reflecting and reimagining these connections, both in the context of historical change and of imagined new alternatives. Psychoanalysis essentially does much the same thing, whilst bringing further emphasis on the real power and force of the variations with which individuals manage their connections to a complicated world. In the contemporary United Kingdom, we saw this, as I've already mentioned, with public discourse over Brexit, the UK's slow and painful exit from the European Union, a political phenomenon that directly reflected the context of global connectedness and renewed nationalisms and social media that I've just outlined. Brexit has been interpreted in psychoanalytic terms as being driven by a fantasy of resolving imperatives that are in reality contradictory, like the imperative to be a completely homogenous and perfectly self-contained nation versus being the kind of winning nation in the global capitalist marketplace. So it's driven by a fantasy of resolving imperatives that are in reality contradictory, which is a function that Freud saw as central to dreams and wish fulfillment fantasies, and indeed he himself saw that as central to forms of political fantasy too. Bring in a couple of novels again here. So the Hungarian-British author David Szalay's 2015 novel, All That Man Is, 2016 novel, consists of a collection of uncannily connected short stories that all takes place in marginal spaces within Britain and the European Union, in overlooked corners of its infrastructure and its tourism. Szalay emphasizes distant connections between people by reimagining those connections not as online, but as material spaces, where psychic structures and needs overlap with what those spaces practically offer for the traveller. Personal needs are thus subtly bound up in that novel with the politics of migration, and specifically of the open borders within parts of the European Union. Szalay's point is not to find utopianism in these submerged connections, but to use the psychic to emphasize the role and the importance of the material and the practical within a globalized world where humans are never fully transparent to each other or even to their own selves. So again, what I'm arguing here, to echo a point earlier, is that in a sense, psychoanalysis is quite relativist in its implications, in that it draws up some fairly sharp divides around what one can ever really know of another person. But at the same time, that relativism doesn't contradict, but rather arises from the fact that there is a relationship between each individual and a kind of shared material reality. It's just that the nexus of those relationships are not transparent to us. So this comes out, I think, in Szalay's novel, and it's not accidental that the spaces in that novel are often rather flat, even boring ones, lacking historical, cultural, and affective depth. So these are not the sort of grand tourist sites of Europe, but rather the sort of spaces in between, the transport spaces and hotel spaces and so forth. And the point is that this ostensible lack of depth does not prevent these spaces becoming places where profound and painful psychic needs can be worked through and consequential actions initiated. And so hierarchies of access to such spaces become ethically and politically significant through the dimensions that psychoanalysis, reading Szalay, can help us to uncover. And the author Kazuo Ishiguro makes a similar point in different, though also subtle terms, in his 2005 novel Never Let Me Go. Now, Never Let Me Go imagines a dystopian Britain where cloning technology has allowed the growth of a two-class society composed of so-called original citizens alongside a clone population that is reared and systematically exploited by the harvesting of their organs. Ishiguro's novel is told from the perspective of some young clones who are sheltered within a relatively liberal and progressive, though ultimately complicit, institution. Ishiguro repeatedly draws attention during the novel to the capacity for material objects to be invested with ambivalent yet profound psychic meaning. The novel's title is also the title of a song, Never Let Me Go, which the protagonist listens to when she happens to acquire an old cassette tape. As in many love songs, the singer in the song addresses a lover as baby, but Kathy, the protagonist, herself a clone, reuses the word for a private fantasy of actually giving birth and raising a child, something that she is in reality as a clone unable to do. In another scene, one of Kathy's friends, Tommy, comes across her flicking through a pornographic magazine. Observing her, he suspects that she is not in fact using the magazine for sexual stimulation, but rather to hunt what they refer to as her possible, that is, the human from whom she was originally cloned, a kind of inaccessible quasi-parent for whom Kathy hunts in the faces of the porn models. Tommy is in fact offering a psychoanalytic reading in that scene. He is making a best guess on what Kathy's socially discordant behavior, what psychoanalysis might call her symptom, indicates about her psychic needs. Though he is probably correct in this particular guess, Kathy's motivations never become wholly transparent to him, or to the reader, or even perhaps to the character herself. And through such unexpected uses and reuses of objects in Never Let Me Go, Ishiguro demonstrates that psychic depth can occur even when it is least expected and can be invested even into the most banal objects used, as in Szalay's All That Man Is, in the most banal of spaces. The object itself, however, like the text, is not merely a neutral vehicle for psychic need. Through its particular properties, much like a narrative, it can significantly shape and influence individual actions and passions. Thus, even though our motivations are never fully transparent to each other or to ourselves, the distribution of material resources and of access to the times and spaces to make use of them still matters here. The implicit demand in Never Let Me Go is, in fact, that we approach the distribution of resources and institutional access without demanding effective transparency from others. And this, I think, is a highly significant ethical and political demand in our context between nationalism and globalization, conflicts between generations, and conflicts between different understandings of reality itself, but one that is nevertheless aligned to the kind of distant connections we are all increasingly invested in. In their engagement with this theme, psychoanalysis and literature, and by extension psychoanalytic literary criticism, emerge as essential for the philosophical basis of an ethics adequate to our contemporary period. So finally, to return to the academic context of this point, I mentioned earlier that in recent times, it's been suggested that psychoanalysis is an underpinning for the practice of literary criticism as a kind of masterful interpretation, where the critic gifted with or trained into penetrative insight finds the hidden depth in a text and lays its meaning bare. It should be clear that it is indeed possible for psychoanalysis to be used as the authority for that kind of critical practice, And indeed, Freud himself can oftentimes appear, at least at first, as that kind of interpreter. What I've tried to argue today, though, is that the necessity of psychoanalysis as a contemporary mode of reading lies rather in its refusal of transparency and its resulting implicit advocacy for autonomy and its recognition of the limits of knowledge and the risks of assumption. In this, it seems to offer its own version of distant reading, one that intellectually acknowledges the depth of individual experience whilst making ethical, political, and civic space for it, but without insisting on any transparent or total mapping of that experience. In this, it seems to be well placed as a tool for the analysis of a world and a period where not only are generations and those of different political ideologies separated from access to a shared reality, but also where we are increasingly encountering the moral and practical limitations of mapping tools such as the algorithm, or, in a different sense, the territorial border. I'm going to stop sharing that point, and I will just end by observing that psychoanalysis is akin to literature itself in that it provides scenarios from which we can infer the real existence of powerful and intimate dynamics in the relationship between the human and the social world, without every instance of those dynamics ever becoming transparent to us. For this reason, it seems to me quite essential for understanding a world where the mediation of reality and experience is changing and challenged across generations, countries, and platforms, and where literature continues to act as a particularly reflective and provocative element within that meditation. So thank you very much indeed. That is the conclusion of my talk, and I will invite colleagues at Litrial to join us.
So that was quite amazing. You have made a very clear and concise presentation of how Freud could be taken in the contemporary time period. I just want to ask you a question of my own, and that would be, I have seen many critics as well as many scholars, even from Yale and other great universities, taking Freud's theories for granted. They tell that Freud's theories do not work anymore, and they have been disproven even in the 20th century. And I do not personally believe that, because only by his works does the entire field of psychoanalysis rests upon. So why do you think that these people often disclaim his contribution to psychoanalysis?
Thanks. That's a really good question, and thanks for the kind comments about the talk as well. So yes, very, very important question. I think those arguments actually stem from the historical context of Freud himself, and for that reason, the register in which Freud is writing doesn't map neatly to the kind of different registers that we use today. And the reason for that, of course, is because Freud begins as a medical professional. He's trained in medicine. He's a scientist, but he proceeds both in his practice and his development of theory in a way that what we would probably characterize now as a more kind of humanities orientated direction. And of course, now we're relatively settled, I think it's fair to say, in the idea that if one is working in the sciences, you're making different kinds of truth claims with different standards of evidence than you are if you're speaking in the humanities, particularly the more theoretical parts of the humanities. But Freud, of course, is not aware of that distinction in the same way, because the distinction has not been solidified in the same way at the time that he's writing, and he never really gives up his claim to scientific authority, even when he moves quite far from what we would see as a scientific framework. So I think that's why today it is very easy to dismiss Freud's theories, because they don't meet contemporary standards of scientific rigor and standards of evidence. And of course, there are good reasons why those standards of rigor and evidence apply to the kinds of truth claims that people make in the sciences or in medicine. There are ethical reasons for that, because when one is treating a patient, it has to be the basis on which one treats the patient has to be rigorous. So there are good reasons for that, but at the same time, I think it doesn't mean, of course, that Freud isn't still very relevant if we understand some of the claims that he's making a little bit differently and in the kind of ways that we would understand them within the humanities. I think there's, sorry, I'm giving a rather long answer, but I think there's also a reason here to use the cliche that whilst Freud may not always have all the right specific answers, he is asking the right questions. And that's the kind of line that I would take. So although, when we look at something like the Oedipus now, we might think that Freud's model of it is much too rigid or much too simplistic or reductive, and it doesn't really completely correspond to scientifically observable phases of individual development. Nevertheless, one can sort of take a step back from that and say, well, okay, that is all true, but Freud was really advocating for the importance of that phase of development in a time when that was not otherwise widely accepted. And now we still accept that it's a very important phase of development, early childhood. So we still agree with him, at least to that extent. Almost universally, people today agree with him to that extent. And we can say that, okay, the model may be a little bit too rigid, but first of all, actually, I think when you get really into the depths of Freud's text, he does kind of move away from his own rigidity a little bit as he goes on, and he does start to talk about it more flexibly. And of course, we can kind of apply our own flexibility to it now as well. So say, okay, so development doesn't always happen exactly according to that model, but nevertheless, the child's engagement with their parents is hugely significant, and it does significantly shape the child's relationships with others as they go through their life, including people that they desire as partners. So I think, we can certainly make an argument that Freud was asking the right questions in that respect.
Splendid, sir. That was quite great. You managed to talk about the division of disciplines that we have in the present time period, and which is making the whole prospect of research and teaching much more easier. And if we happen to take the perspective of a literary student, we have done our BA and we have done our MA and so on. We have just read poetry, novel and fiction and so on. But how deep should a literary student go in order to find out a literary or a psychoanalytic theory to work? And how should he look for these theories? And do you suggest any particular book, or how deep should he actually go and take that particular discipline on?
Sure. I think personally, obviously, I sort of would say this, of course, because this is kind of part of what I do. But I think certainly any undergraduate literature student, I think personally, should have at least a basic engagement with Freud as part of their study. There are many different routes into that. I think that there are some very good introductory works out there. I mentioned during my talk another British psychoanalytic literary critic called Josh Cohen, who works at Goldsmiths, which is an institution in London. He has a really great introduction to Freud book, so that's one that I would point students towards. He also has some very interesting, still quite easily accessible theoretical work as well, which some of which I kind of drew on a little bit in my talk. So I'd recommend Josh's book as an introduction. I do think as well, though, direct engagement with some of Freud's own writing is advisable. It's sort of bit difficult to characterize Freud as to how accessible he is, but I think certainly some of his work is certainly quite accessible. And personally, I would encourage students to start with some of the case histories, which again I mentioned in my talk, because those give a really vivid and quite narrative a sense of how Freud's theories emerged through the treatment of particular patients. And you get all the sort of historical and social context of Vienna at the time as well. So I think those are quite compelling narratives. They're also very strange and surprising at the start. So they're quite an exciting read. So I would encourage students to engage with Freud directly, probably through the case histories first. Another, of course, way into talking about Freud and psychoanalysis with students is to go through the popular culture angle, because I mentioned in my talk that Freud has had a really massive influence on popular culture, particularly because essentially his ideas got picked up in the United States very heavily around about the middle of the 20th century, and they influence Hollywood a lot. So there are lots of, bits of popular culture that one could draw on and kind of giving an introduction to Freud for students. So one of the things that I talked about, as I mentioned in my talk, around in horror films, for example, Freudian ideas are really, really significant, where you've got lots of very Oedipal children going out and committing murders. And that's using Freud in a really, really exploitative way, but it's quite a helpful way into the topic, because what I can do with students then is to say, well, okay, this film appears to be using Freud, but it's not doing so accurately. So can we try to identify together why it's kind of inaccurate or exploitative? And that, of course, is another way into talking about the ideas. So I hope that gives some helpful suggestions there.
Definitely, sir. I think this is something that many students of literature would love to hear, and this would clarify all their doubts, because they find themselves in quite a pickle when they want to lean over to an entirely new discipline and come up with a theory that could be applied to literature. And another thing that I want to ask would be, even in Freud's lifetime, how interested was he in literature in particular, or the effects of literature in particular?
Very, very interested. So he was an avid reader. He had a very good knowledge, particularly of what were canonical texts in his own time, many of which are still canonical texts. So I mentioned Shakespeare and Goethe, for example, he draws on very, very heavily. So yeah, he was very much engaged with a large literary canon, and does occasionally discuss some other novels and short stories that were popular at the time as well. Some of which are perhaps primarily known through his having referred to them now. And I'm thinking there, for example, of in Freud's essay "The Uncanny," which is a very, very famous and influential piece of work. He talks a lot about P.T. Hoffman's story, "The Sandman," and I think that's he's kind of kept that piece of literature well known through having used it in the way that he does in his own essay. So yeah, Freud was very, very much engaged with literature always, and as I mentioned, I think he does write in quite a literary way as well. But again, particularly in the case studies, he's really interested in narrative. I think that really is quite a constant feature of Freud's work and his thought is the narrative style.
Okay. So I think the questions from my side are over, and I think our YouTube audience will be anxiously waiting for their questions to be answered. And this question we have from Anusha Hegde, and she asks, how can we analyze the identity crisis and conflicts of identifying oneself with the world in works like Divergent and other dystopian young adult fiction? For example, the adolescent protagonists.
Thanks very much indeed for the question. Unfortunately, I'm not so directly familiar with the particular young adult fiction that you're referring to, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to be a bit limited in how directly I can answer that. So I do apologise, but certainly I can say that in general terms, any kind of identity crisis and the rooting of that in a period of adolescence, in childhood and adolescent development, is something that is fundamental to Freudian thought. And I'm sure that by reading those texts with some psychoanalytic theory in mind, that there will be new bits of richness and insight that you get into those texts. That does as well, I think, speak very much to the influence of Freud on more recent work on gender and sexuality and how that applies to development. So, and I would probably turn to that whole area of scholarship. And I mentioned during my talk one major theoretical book in my field, which is Catherine Bond Stockton's The Queer Child. And I think that has a lot, although the title identifies it as about children, I think it has quite a lot to do with adolescence as well. So, that might be a useful theoretical book to have a look at.
And here we have another question from Mr. TK. And is it possible to psychoanalyze an absurd play like, for instance, Waiting for Godot?
Thanks. So I think yes is the answer to that, in the sense that it's possible to talk about it in psychoanalytic terms. Of course, the characters in Waiting for Godot are clearly very different to characters that you might find in other, perhaps more conventional types of texts. So you can't psychoanalyze them in exactly the same sense because you're not given enough information, as it were. Nevertheless, you still, even in Waiting for Godot, of course, you have the basic dynamic between two people talking about a third person unseen, and the third person is of kind of slightly ambiguous reality. So in a way, that is quite close to psychoanalytic situation, in that you have your two people, the analyst and the person being analyzed, and they're talking about other people or other things that are going on in the world. So it does compare to some extent. And I think Waiting for Godot is probably quite a rich text for that, in the sense that it is obviously concerned with those themes around the mediation of reality that I referred to, and how people negotiate different claims about reality is clearly very, very key to it as well. So I think the answer is absolutely yes. And of course, I think it's also worth bearing in mind that the absurd style of that play, of course, relates to its position in the mid-20th century, which is influenced by some of the artistic and intellectual movements that had gone before. So I'm thinking of things like surrealism, for example, which Freud has quite a significant influence on the surrealists. So you can start to trace a link from Freud through these different movements in the first part of the 20th century, through to things like the absurd and Samuel Beckett and so forth.
Wonderful, sir. So we have another question from Anusha Hedge, and she tells, keeping in mind Barthes' insistence on the reader deriving pleasure from the text, can we see this as a reader's satisfaction of having expressed the unconscious conflicts while actively reading?
So I think yes is the answer to that, and I think that's a very fruitful claim to make, and a fruitful frame to apply to these issues. So I think yes, absolutely. I mean, I didn't talk really today about, I suppose, the act of reading and the kinds of satisfaction that the reader gains from that. And how the pleasure that one gains from reading relates to the kinds of pleasure that Freud is interested in, because Freud is absolutely concerned with pleasure. It starts as very central to all his theories, but it becomes increasingly complex as he goes on. So eventually he formulates the idea of the death drive, which goes with the idea that in fact human behavior is not all driven by an economy of managing pleasure in the way that he initially thought. So Freud's ideas in that area are very complex, and I think there's a lot to explore around how that relates to the act of reading and the types of satisfaction that one draws from that. So yeah, I think you're onto a very rich area of inquiry there.
Well said, sir. So in a more subjective opinion, I should say that psychoanalysis is perhaps the most practical approach towards analyzing literature. And I think I've always given it much more importance rather than other kinds of or other approaches to literary criticism. So can you give us a time frame or a period of time when you exactly found out that psychoanalysis would be the best approach for interpreting literature?
For me personally, you mean?
Yes, sir, personally.
Yeah. Gosh, that's a good question. I think, for me, it was from very relatively early in my studies. So it was definitely from while I was still an undergraduate myself. So I think, as I said earlier, I'd absolutely encourage people, literature students, to engage with psychoanalysis while they are still at undergraduate level. I think that's absolutely right. And I think many of them will find it very compelling and exciting as an area to be drawn into. So that was certainly true for me. So yeah, it would have been at some point during my undergraduate degree, but I can't tell you exactly when now, I think. But I think it developed gradually over time. And I think the reason that I, became so invested in it was the fact that the psychoanalytic theories are quite strange, right? In a way, they make a lot of claims that seem very strange at first glance, which is why, of course, some people do prefer to say, "Oh, Freud's all been discredited now, so we don't have to talk about him anymore." I think that speaks to a certain discomfort that some people have with psychoanalysis, because its ideas do seem quite wild or strange. But I think that of course is also what makes it exciting at the same time. And I think it also relates very much to the strangeness of literature itself, because literary fiction does offer this sort of slightly strange space between historical reality, the imagination of the individual, and the act of reading, all grouped around this text that is fictional, but of course it still has some kind of relationship to reality that we presumably think is significant, because that's where we take the time to read it, and certainly if we take the time to read and analyze it. So yeah, I think it was that. Speaking to the strangeness of literature itself, that sort of drew me into it and sustained the influence on it, my interest in it as well. I think also because, as I've alluded to, psychoanalysis is I think quite a flexible theoretical framework. So there is space to use it quite creatively, to take ideas from Freud, but to reshape them as one thinks that one's own historical moment or the text one is dealing with demands. And I think that makes it quite resilient and quite sort of sustainable as a mode of literary criticism. And I think that's what's kept me going with it, as well as, of course, the fact that I do work on representations of children, as I mentioned, and I think it would be very hard to talk about changing representations of children and not talk about Freud and psychoanalysis. I think it would just be historically incomplete to leave them out. So I think that keeps the connection going very much for me.
Great, sir. I think those were all the questions from our YouTube audience. You have given quite concise and detailed descriptions of all the questions that were asked to you. Thank you so much. And before we come to the end of this particular episode, I would I'd like to ask you some words of advice to our young scholars who are dealing with psychoanalysis.
Sure. I think, don't be put off if it seems difficult at first. It is in the nature of theoretical work, particularly theoretical work that's produced in a different historical period, to be difficult at times, to be inaccessible. But I think find what is exciting in it and kind of work from that, which is why I've advocated so much for looking closely into the case histories, because I think those are the texts where you can really see the rootedness of psychoanalysis in actual encounters between Freud and other people, and his attempts to understand what had happened to those people to bring them to the conditions that they were in when he encountered them. So I think if you start from that very compelling human element at the center of it, and kind of work outward from there to the theory, particularly if the theory seems a little, difficult or obtuse or just perhaps hard to believe at first.
Thank you so much, sir. And to our audience, I think some of you would have missed a brief introduction about our guest of the hour. So for them, I would like to give it another go, and I hope this will serve the initiative. Dr. Dominic Dean is an early career researcher in contemporary British fiction, a lecturer in the medicinal humanities and a research policy professional based at the University of Sussex, United Kingdom. Dr. Dean gained his doctorate in English literature at the University of Warwick in 2017. His research focuses on the representation of children in modern and contemporary British fiction in the context of migration, queerness, and intergenerational conflict. He has published widely in edited collections and academic journals, including work on violent authenticity in the novels of Kazuo Ishiguro, in textual practice on migrant children in Ishiguro in the Journal of Commonwealth Literature, and on Thatcherism's disappearing children in literature and history. Dr. Dean is currently writing a monograph for Sunny Press on children who kill in British fiction, from Thatcherism to Brexit. His research uses a psychoanalytic and historicist framework to explore these issues. Dr. Dean currently works at the University of Sussex in a role split between teaching on literature and psychoanalysis in the medicinal humanities, and leading the university's submission to REF 2021, the UK's National Research Assessment Exercise. He has published on UK research policy and the humanities in the Times, Higher Education, and elsewhere. And with that said, thank you so much, sir. Thank you for being a part of this particular episode. We have cherished this experience with you. Thank you so much.
It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for organizing, and thank you to everyone who's listened and asked questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.